Now that we have a fundamental understanding of how the brain is structured, we're going to begin a discussion of how the brain functions. And in order to do that, we have to consider both the gross divisions of the brain and the developmental divisions of the brain. Remember, when we examine the brain grossly, we can break it into sections that include the cerebrum, the cerebellum, and the brainstem. The brainstem, of course, consists of the midbrain, the pons, and the medulla oblongata. But it turns out that there's another way that we can think of the brain structurally that actually relates more accurately to its function. These functional sections, if you will, include the forebrain, the midbrain, and the hindbrain. Now, this way of looking at the brain's structure comes from the way that the brain develops in the fetus. Now, we don't need to be embryologists to understand this concept. We just need to remember that the embryo first develops into 3 distinct layers. Those layers include the ectoderm, the mesoderm, and the endoderm. These 3 layers that develop very early in the human embryo are going to give rise to all of the structures in the human body. It's the ectoderm layer that gives rise to the brain. Now, from the ectoderm, the brain will develop 3 distinct regions: the forebrain, the midbrain, and the hindbrain. Now, I've included some other terminology here, just so you're familiar with it. The forebrain is also referred to as the prosencephalon. The forebrain contains the cerebral hemispheres, the thalamus, and the hypothalamus. And you can see that those structures are sometimes referred to telencephalon, that's the cerebrum, and diencephalon, those are the thalamus and the hypothalamus. The midbrain is composed of the upper portion of the brainstem. In other words, what we call the midbrain of the brainstem corresponds to the midbrain in the developing fetus. The midbrain also is referred to as mesencephalon. And finally, there's the hindbrain, or the rhombencephalon. The hindbrain is composed of the cerebellum and the remaining portion of the brainstem, so the pons and the medulla oblongata. We're going to refer to these 3 developmental regions, these 3 functional regions of the brain, as the forebrain, the midbrain, and the hindbrain for the rest of our discussion. On this slide, we have 2 drawings of the brain that's been cut in half into left and right cerebral hemispheres and remaining structures of the brain. Up on the top left, we can see the cerebrum. We can see the thalamus and the hypothalamus in this darker brownish red color. We can see the ventricles drawn in here and here. Together, the hypothalamus, the thalamus, and the cerebrum make up the forebrain. The midbrain, remember, corresponds to the midbrain of the brainstem. And the hindbrain is composed of the cerebellum, the pons, and the medulla oblongata. We have another drawing down here on the right. Again, cerebrum, thalamus, shown in yellow, hypothalamus. These 3 structures make up the forebrain. This is the midbrain of the brainstem, which corresponds to the midbrain. And the hindbrain includes the cerebellum, the pons, and the medulla oblongata. We'll begin with the forebrain and the cerebrum. Remember, the cerebrum is the largest part of the human brain. It constitutes about 83% of the weight or the mass of the brain. The cerebrum is composed of two halves, two cerebral hemispheres. They're separated from each other by a large fissure called the longitudinal fissure. But they are connected to each other with a bridge of tissue called the corpus callosum, and that's shown here in red. Remember, the cerebral hemispheres are covered in gyri and sulci. The raised ridges are the gyri, and the grooves between those ridges are the sulci. It's estimated that the gray matter of the cerebrum contains somewhere between 14 and 16 billion neurons in a healthy adult. Those neuron cell bodies are located in the cortices, or the two individual cortex regions of each hemisphere. Remember, in the brain, that gray matter, those cortices, are layered on top of the white matter. There's also gray matter found in what are called deep nuclei of the cerebrum. There are basal nuclei that are located lateral to the thalamus, one on each side. And there are also nuclei of what's known as the limbic system. The limbic system is considered the most primitive portion of the human brain. Sometimes people refer to it as our reptilian brain. The limbic system is the part of the brain that controls some of our most basic primal emotions. And it's composed of 4 different deep nuclei. 2 of those deep nuclei are part of the cerebrum. Those are called the amygdala and the hippocampus. The other 2 parts of the limbic system are the thalamus and the hypothalamus. But remember, the thalamus and the hypothalamus are not part of the cerebrum. They're their own separate structures. But together, they are part of the forebrain. So the entire limbic system is found in the forebrain. And again, that makes sense because the forebrain is a division based on function. Within the forebrain, the cerebrum is going to be involved in neural integration. On this slide, we can see drawings of the cerebrum in cross-section in the upper left and as a full brain that we can peer into on the lower right. If we start up here, again, the brain has been cut in half through the corpus callosum. So we're looking at the edge of one hemisphere. You can see the cerebrum here drawn in a beige color. And then we've got the amygdala in red and the hippocampus in green. So you can see that the limbic system, at least the portion of it that belongs to the cerebrum, is located very deep into the brain. In this lower image, again, we're peering through the tissue of the cerebrum and staring at the hippocampus, shown in blue, and the amygdala, shown in yellow. The amygdala and the hippocampus, remember, are part of the limbic system, and they are considered deep nuclei of the cerebrum. Now, in addition to the gray matter of the cerebrum, it also has white matter. Remember that white matter in the brain is located deep to the gray matter, and it's white matter that contains the axons from all of the neuron cell bodies. The cerebral white matter actually occupies most of the volume of the cerebrum. And all of those axons, remember, are organized into what we would think of as nerves. But remember, in the central nervous system, we don't call them nerves. Instead, we call them tracts. Now, there are 3 categories of tracts in the cerebral white matter that we need to be familiar with. There are projection tracts, commissural tracts, and association tracts. The projection tracts are those tracts that extend vertically between higher and lower portions of the brain and spinal cord. The commissural tracts cross from one hemisphere to another hemisphere through the commissure. And finally, there are association tracts that connect different regions within the same hemisphere. In addition to the tracts of the cerebral white matter, remember there are also glial cells in the cerebrum. Astrocytes, microglial cells, those are the cells that are part of the immune system, and the oligodendrocytes that perform the function of myelinating axons. The cerebrum is quite large, and as we've said, it's covered in gyri and sulci. When we examine the cerebrum grossly from the outside, we can see that there are several particularly prominent sulci. And what those do is divide each cerebral hemisphere into distinct lobes. Now, we give these lobes names. We can describe the frontal lobe, the parietal lobe, the occipital lobe, and the temporal lobe. There's one of each of these lobes in each cerebral hemisphere. On this slide, I've provided a very brief summary of what each lobe is involved in functionally. For example, the frontal lobe is associated with voluntary motor functions, as well as higher mental functions, intellectual functions. The parietal lobe, in comparison, is involved in sensory information, general somesthetic or body sense information, things like touch and pressure and pain. The parietal lobe is also involved in some taste and visual processing. The occipital lobe is generally thought of as a visual center, and the temporal lobe is associated with hearing and smell, as well as learning and memory, and some aspects of vision and emotion. We're going to talk at more depth about the function of each lobe in just a few minutes. Something else to realize is that the temporal lobe is sometimes subdivided into a deeper sort of sublobe and then the remaining tissue. That sublobe is referred to in some sources as the insular lobe or the insular cortex. This is the part of the temporal lobe associated with language, taste, and integrating certain types of sensory information. Some source materials also refer to the limbic system as a lobe, but that language is rarely used now. Instead, we refer to it as the limbic system. On this slide, we can see a drawing of these lobes as they lie within one of the cerebral hemispheres. You can see here on the upper left, the person is facing towards the left. This represents the frontal lobe. Sitting directly behind it is the parietal lobe in yellow. And I think you can see that there's a very prominent sulcus dividing one lobe from the other. At the back of the cerebrum, there is the occipital lobe and then the temporal lobe. You can just see the shadow of an outline for the cerebellum right here. So these 4 lobes are involved in very different functions with regards to what the cerebrum does. And they're separated from each other by these very prominent sulci. Down here, we have a drawing where the temporal lobe is actually being opened up right along this sulcus. They're using these tools to peel back the outer layers of the temporal lobe, and they're highlighting this inner area that, again, is often referred to as the insular lobe. Now, on Canvas, I've provided for you a file that contains supplementary images to highlight what each lobe is involved in terms of function. You can see that this was taken from that supplementary text that I recommended to everyone at the start of the semester. It's a visual learning tool. You can see the frontal lobe is drawn here, and then the frontal lobe is divided into this area that's shown in a white color, this region which is in light gray, this region which is in pink, this region in a dark gray, and this region in pink. So within the frontal lobe, the drawing is highlighting for us that there are really 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 separate functional regions. If you look at the table that I also included in that supplement, we can look at the cerebrum and the lobes broken down into 3 functional areas: the sensory areas, the motor areas, and then what are called the association areas. I've added in some highlight, and I've also penciled in some other terms for us here. You can see that within the motor areas, the word frontal appears again and again. The primary motor cortex portion is the area of the frontal lobe that controls voluntary muscle movements throughout the body, including those of the hands and feet, the arms and legs, the face, and the tongue. If we go back to the drawing, we can see that the primary motor cortex is this strip right here, highlighted in pink. There's also what's referred to as a premotor cortex in the frontal lobe. This area is sort of what they call a choreographer for the primary motor cortex. It chooses, if you will, which muscle groups need to be used and how they're going to be used before the primary cortex gets stimulated. You can see in the drawing, this gray region, this very light gray region, is labeled as the premotor cortex. There's an area in the frontal lobe that's referred to as Broca's area. This is the area for motor speech. This is the area that controls and coordinates muscles that are involved in speaking, in speech itself. And if you go back to the drawing, you can see Broca's area right here in pink. And the last region of the frontal lobe is what's referred to as the frontal eye field. That's this little region right here in dark gray. The frontal eye field is the area that controls muscle movements of the eye, including those that are allowing you to see what you're looking at right now and read it clearly. So, as you can see, the frontal lobe is greatly involved in motor activity. It's receiving information, of course, as the entire brain is. It's integrating that sensory information, and then it's having a large effect on motor output from all of these regions that we've reviewed. But there is one area in the frontal lobe that we haven't mentioned yet, And that's this area shown in white, what's referred to as the prefrontal area, sometimes called the prefrontal cortex. If we go back to the table here, you can see that that is not included in the motor areas, but rather in the association areas. These association areas are often located near sensory areas, and they're involved in analyzing incoming information. Again, part of the integration that the brain performs. The prefrontal area, or cortex, is the area that is most highly developed in humans and other primates. The prefrontal area is involved in the regulation of emotion and behavior and mood. It's also very important in planning, learning, reasoning, motivation, your personality, and your intellect. Now let's take a look at the parietal lobe. Remember, the parietal lobe sits here, and it also is subdivided into this dark gray area, this white area, a light gray region, and another dark gray region. If we go to the table, we can see that the parietal lobe is involved in some sensory processing. The primary somatic sensory cortex is located in the parietal lobe. That's the region that's shown here in dark gray. The primary somatic sensory cortex is the area that controls general sensory input. So we're talking about touch, pressure, temperature, pain. All regions of the body send that sensory information to this primary somatic sensory cortex for integration. Now, there's another region of the parietal lobe that we can see in this sensory area table, and that's the gustatory cortex. If we go back to the drawing, the gustatory cortex is shown right here in white. The gustatory cortex is the part of the parietal lobe that is involved in taste sensation. Now we have to move down our table to the association areas in order to find the remaining regions of the parietal lobe. There's a region called the somatic sensory association area, and another one called the sensory speech area, or what is most commonly known as Wernicke's area. If we go back to the drawing, you can see that Wernicke's area is right here in dark gray. Wernicke's area is a sensory speech area. It's critical for language development because it helps us learn to process words that we hear other people saying. So this is not about the motor aspect of speech. This is about processing what words we're hearing. It's a critical area for children as they're learning speech because it helps them learn new language, new vocabulary. The other region is the somatic sensory association area. And in this drawing, it's located here in light gray. The somatic sensory association area is the part of the parietal lobe that allows us to predict that certain things are going to create certain sensations. So, for example, it allows us to predict that when we touch sandpaper, it's going to be rough. Or when we touch glass, it's going to be smooth and cool. We don't even need to look at the thing that we're about to touch because we can predict what it's going to feel like. It stores memories, in other words, of what sensory experiences we've had in the past. If we move on to the temporal lobe, we can see the auditory cortex and the auditory association area. And in the table, we see that the auditory cortex is the place where auditory sensations or auditory stimuli are processed. In comparison, the auditory association area is where we comprehend and interpret and analyze and question what we're hearing. The final lobe is the occipital lobe at the back of the brain. The occipital lobe is associated with vision. We can see a visual cortex and a visual association area. The visual cortex, again, is where visual images are going to be perceived. In comparison, the visual association area is allowing us to associate that image that we're perceiving with what we know it to be in terms of our understanding of that image and what we call that image, and so on. The visual association area is thought of as our mind's eye, because when we hear the name of a particular object, we can picture what that object looks like because of our visual association area. So, the cerebrum has 4 distinct lobes: frontal, parietal, occipital, and temporal, and they all have very different functions.